Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our event here this evening at the Advanced Research Centre with Rog Glass and Willy Maley. My name is Saoirse Dallas. I'm the custodian of the Alasdair Gray Archive. Really delighted to welcoming you here this afternoon. So this is the first in our kind of series of the Alasdair and Others series. I'll tell you a wee bit about that in a moment. But for those of you who've not visited us already, this is a little bit about the order of events for tonight. So I'm just going to give you a little brief introduction to the archive. I'll hand over then to Rog, who's going to discuss his connection to Willy and to Alasdair, and to introduce a new biography that he's written about Willy and the connective threads between him and Gray's work. There'll be an opportunity within that presentation to sort of discuss and explore a little bit about the archival material that Willy's donated, that we've also displayed over here for you guys to explore at the end too. There'll be an opportunity for some questions and answers. You can then explore the box. I hope that sounds good. For those of you who've not come to visit us at the Alasdair Gray Archive, I worked with Alasdair Gray since 2007 and was largely responsible for the critical reappraisal in his visual work. So it's been a bit of a labour of love over the last few years, making the case to really salvage 5,000 items that came from his home, to reinstate them at the Whisky Bond, as you can see, part recreation of his living and working space. So really thinking about the immersive potential of his work. Obviously, we're trying to conserve and protect this collection, but we're thinking about growing it and building it all the time too. And one of the ways in which we're trying to do that is through this new series called Alasdair and Others. And what we're really trying to do is map the kind of connective threads between Alasdair and his work. He was a socially focused, deeply communal maker, and that's what we're trying to kind of honour and explore through the archive too. And one of the ways in which we're doing that is through this Alasdair and Others series. And so what we're starting to do is we're starting to explore opening up different parts of the collection and donating and really fixing others within that story too. So one of the ways in which we've been doing that through donations and acquisitions is through these archival boxes. And Willy's one of the first ones of that have been donated in. We're also, where appropriate, starting to form satellite archives too. And our first one's going to be opening next year, and it's dedicated to the much overlooked working class writer Agnes Owen. So we've been working with her family to create her own standalone archive within the Alasdair Gray archive too. And one of the ways in which we want to really do that is to think about a non-hierarchical approach to who we're focusing within the collection too. So, alongside Willy's, we've got a box dedicated to Archie Hind, another writer, to Liz Lockhead, to Tom Leonard, but we've also got one of Alasdair's early cleaners who he couldn't always pay in cash, so he would often write poems to her. So we're trying to create this non-hierarchical way in which we're mapping the influences around Alasdair, which I know we're going to be talking about that in terms of collaborative approaches and practices with Rog and Willy now. But I just want to quickly introduce Rog, who is a real partner in all things Gray. We work very closely together on commissions and on research projects. He was Gray's former secretary and biographer. He's going to talk about his own connection to Alasdair, and of course then his deep connection with Willy too. So if you would like to welcome Rog and Willy.
My microphone's on. Yes. My microphone's on. My microphone is on. Hi, folks. Thank you very much for coming. This is lovely. This is my idea of a good time. My name is Rod Glass. I'm going to be picking up on a number of the things that Saoirse introduced briefly there, talking about writing communities, how we support each other, what a writing community is, what co-authorship is, why it matters, how we do things together. And this is a lovely opportunity to be able to interrogate those issues with the first of these public events, which is part of Alasdair and Others. We like this. I say, Saoirse, can I refer to us as the royal we? Right. We can be anti-royal, but pro-royal we. Okay. I say that we like these things because there was a meaningful connection between this approach that we'll be exploring today and the way that Alasdair went about his own visual and literary practice over 7 decades plus, which is rather than seeing yourself as an artist at the top of the mountain, looking down at everybody else, telling everybody why you matter and what they need to learn from you, but rather to refuse the idea that there's a mountain at all. And that's, I hope, a decent way of starting off our conversation today. We're going to tease out a handful of things that Willy has donated to the Alasdair Gray Archive. We'll talk about a few things in my biography of Willy. I did consider just reading out my entire biography of Willy to you to fill up the time as a way of trolling him so he can't get a word in. But rather than do that, I will simply start by saying that the piece itself is called The Collaborative, the Communal, the Co-authored. And what I've done here is to attempt to do a sort of community biography of Willy's intersections with Alasdair Gray over the years, giving space to Willy's own work, his own research in multiple different areas, his own family life and upbringing, but then also looking in particular at the places where Willy worked with or alongside or critiqued Alasdair Gray's work, and then also trying to draw out some of the threads that are clearly there in the ways that both Willy and Alasdair approached working with others and being a, as Willy puts it, servant of the servants of art. And not everybody sees things that way. So I want to be able to get into that as well. Can I ask you to just one more time warmly welcome Willy, please? Professor Willy Maley was my PhD supervisor, and if I hadn't been suggested to do a PhD by you, I wouldn't have done it. And my PhD was my biography of Alasdair, so you changed my life in material ways. Where do you want to start, Willy? Shall we talk about how you first came across Alasdair Gray's work?
Well, I would have come across Alasdair. Everybody can hear me okay?
Yeah.
After the publication of Lanark, because that was a real landmark breakthrough book. I think when I first heard about Alasdair as a person, it was probably in the 1990s. When I started at Glasgow, and Philip Hobsbaum, who was a great admirer and supporter of Alasdair, he spoke about his experiences of encountering Alasdair in the 1970s prior to the publication of Lanark, which took 30 years to complete.
Philip was a really important figure here at Glasgow University,
wasn't he? Yeah, yeah. Mentor, creative writing, tutor and mentor for years. Philip helped a lot of other people to get published and to write. He used to say to me, you can be walking about with a great novel in his head, but he didn't get a chance to write it because he was quite selfless in that sense of giving to others. But I remember Philip could talk for Scotland, probably for Ireland too. But he said at one time, incidentally, I've got a problem with my tongue just now, which is a side effect of treatment I've been getting. So if at some point I start like a bad root because that's what's happening. So I'll take a moment.
That's okay.
Get the tongue to behave. Yeah, but Philip was not a quiet person. He is very loud. And he was telling me that he'd been in the 1970s in the Ruby Act in Byres Road, and that Alasdair had been holding forth. And Philip listened to him for a while and he said, you know, people would pay to hear your discourse. And people were paying to hear Philip's discourse. But what Philip shared with Alasdair, I think, was two things. First of all, massive erudition, learning, was very widely read. That's the first thing. Obviously, the second thing, which is very important and which impacts on Alasdair Gray's work like Poor Things, is that he wasn't a snob. And neither was Philip. Now, without mentioning any writers, some writers will talk about genre fiction in a disparaging way, or different kinds of fiction. You know, literary fiction or nothing.
Yeah.
I remember a creative writing student going to a creative writing tutor one time and showing him a piece of work, which was a good piece of work. But the person said, I'm getting off this a whiff of pan paperback. A whiff of pan paperback, which is a kind of put down. You know, you write like Harold Robbins or it's popular fiction. Alasdair didn't have that, and Philip didn't have that. Philip, as a creative writing tutor, whoever came through the door, whatever shape or form the writing took, he embraced that. And Alasdair too was widely read, but no, you know, I always cite examples like Brecht on football or James Joyce on the music hall. Alasdair and Philip both recognised the great work that came out of popular culture and the quality and value and spirit of popular culture, if you like. So I think it's important to say other working class writers might be different, but Alasdair was never a snob when it came to work, and that allowed him to immerse himself in genre fiction as he did do, to be as widely read as he was. So him and Philip had that in common, I think, as something that brought them together. They weren't snobs, and they were immensely widely read, not just deeply read.
Do you think that working with Philip was an influence on the way that you then interacted with others inside the university and outside of it? You know, as a model for how you might encourage intellectual learning, support other people, collaborate, co-author?
Without a doubt. I mean, I used to hear, you heard the expression, somebody's pro-student, that some called him was pro-student, as though you could be anti-student.
Yeah.
And Philip, I always remember that moment in Gladiator when Russell Crowe says, get ready for whatever comes through those doors before the tigers come in. And that's what Philip was like with any student. They come through, everyone's different. The person might be writing a book about baseball, you're not interested in baseball, that's not the point. They might write the best book about baseball you've ever, known. But Philip usually did. When somebody said they were writing a particular book, Philip would know all the books in that genre and of that type. So I think he did teach me that, and so he helped me to think about being open to what counted as literature. Yeah. So just see that as a starting
definitely
a point.
Well, let's walk forward from that point. I'm glad that you've mentioned Philip, because you and he set up the Glasgow University Creative Writing Programme. Yeah. And then it was only a couple of years after that that you were working with Alasdair as a collaborator yourself. Yeah. So for those that don't know your own background, can you say just a little bit about what your role was there? Because it was a real change for you, wasn't it? Because you were a creative writer, you'd had a very full creative life before that point, and you made a change at that point consciously, did you know?
I had a very modest career as a minor polemical figure and occasional playwright. I did plays on at Mayfest from 1989 to 1995. Community theatre, shoestring theatre, threadbare theatre, that was my involvement in creative writing. But in 1992 I went to Goldsmiths, and at Goldsmiths I was encouraged to teach a course called Exciting Times, and get ready for it, working with language, creating a text.
I'm confused already.
Yeah, so I was doing the drama strand with a poet and with a journalist. Very good poet, Sarah Maguire. But it was like a course in creative writing without saying it's creative writing, because that was, the kiss of death for academic courses
at that time.
At that time, very early days of creative writing, before the St Andrews course got launched, before the Glasgow one. So when I came to Glasgow, I had that bit of baggage that I taught creative writing. Philip Hobsbaum had been unofficially mentoring creative writers for years as a kind of extra thing that he did in people around his house and so on. And Philip said to me, look, let's, a bit like Macaroni and Judy Garland, let's throw a tent up and declare that we're going to have a course in creative writing. We got away with murder. We only had 2 students in the first year. There's no master's course that we'd ever run with 2 students in the first year. But it became a flagship, it became a very popular course. We got away with minimal admin, draft. We basically said we'd like to do this course. It's a master's in creative writing. And because it was 1995, Philip was close to retirement, I was only starting at Glasgow. We got through we slipped through, we got away with it. We started a course which really didn't have, now you have to have a business plan and 10 students in the first year to have any chance of doing the course. So we did it, we started and we bungee jumped it, as it were, doing it, and Philip always said, you never know if you're going to be sitting talking to the first student's going to be a book a prize winner, or you never know that. Well, we ended up with a writer shortlist for the book. But we also ended up with one of our first students with a fantastic name of land, J. Napoleon, wrote a novel which was then made into a film directed by David S. Moyer, the director of Batman Returns, starring Wesley Snipes, Oliver Platt, and so on. So from tiny acorns, big things came, and they came through one thing, belief. And as Philip would say, you give writers their head. Mm-hmm. People who come in, they want to write, you don't say, don't write that because I'm not interested in baseball or whatever. You direct them towards the best that's been written in that field, mm-hmm. and you try to get the best out of what they're writing. So I think that's so important. I remember one time somebody looked at one of the books that ended up being very successful, and they said, "Is it any good?" And I said, "Well, we think so, and the writer thinks so," and it turned out it was very good. So I think
you can't necessarily guarantee a Wesley Snipes adaptation in the early days, but you can work on particular principles and keep those principles consistent. I like the way you talk about, I didn't know that phrase that Philip had used about giving a writer their head, but I immediately recognise what it means. And it is a kind of humility, but I suggest it's a kind of community-minded spirit as well. There doesn't ever seem to be, I mean, this was a little bit before I came into the course, but there never seemed to be a sort of sense that the proper writers were up here, and that you were down there, and that you needed to serve them in some way, which is why I like this phrase, servant of the servants of art. Can you tell us what that is?
I wish I could remember it. But before I tell you that, I'll mention one person. Shug Hanlon was one of the students who came on the course, and Shug was a kind of comic writer of a particular type. He was influenced by the Beats, by Richard Brautigan and so on. So he was a bit like a kind of Scottish social surrealist, but his writing was kind of slightly out there. And the minute I arrived, I thought, what's Philip going to make of him? But Philip his door was always open to any new form of writing, no matter how short, how long, how grassroots, how highfalutin and so on. The phrase "the servant of the servants of art" was used by Alasdair, because he said that writers were the servants of the servants of art. And
yeah, I think so.
I might be getting this completely wrong, because it ends up as a term from, I believe, scripture, is that right?
Yeah.
So this term, I always associated this with Alasdair, but I realised Alasdair, in his best tradition, had picked up this phrase and recycled it, servant of the servants of art, because that's how Alasdair saw the writers were the servants of art, and critics were the servants of the servants of art. That's the line. And I think Philip was very happy with that title. I mean, I was going to joke at it and say, I'm glad I'm here to talk about my favourite person, and we'll also mention Alasdair. But in actual fact, I like being another. And I think Philip had that. Philip had a very strong sense of himself, a capacity to be self-effacing in order to raise up an apprentice writer. And so I think that's a great gift.
Yeah, that's lovely. I want to come to your collaborations with Alasdair and what we can learn from that, and specifically to what's in the box of goodies that you've donated to the Alasdair Gray Archive. But before I do that, I just wanted to ask one question about your own background, because here we are talking about communitarian ways of being, how we support other people, love of literature, giving people their head. But that doesn't come out of a vacuum for anybody. And part of what this biography discusses is your early life and those influences and how they helped you see the world as you do. Can you give us a quick
sense? Because none of my family are here, so I can speak freely. Because I'm one of 9 children, the 7th of 9, and you're not one of 9 children. I've got 5 older sisters, or had 5 older sisters, 3 brothers. You really had to be careful what you said. And it's always interesting to hear people who are only children talk about their parents, their legacy, their family, and this, and you think you don't have anybody looking over your shoulder, which you do when you're part of a big family. You can't write anything autobiographical or biographical. It's very difficult because it's a shared legacy. But I think that sense of how can you be an individual when you're one of 9, it's very difficult. And I think we used to watch the Waltons, and the 11 of us sitting watching the Waltons, it was like looking in the mirror. It was the only time we watched anything that remotely represented us, because everything else was, to our own children. So I think, I would credit that fact, the fact of the 7th of 9 children, so subordinate position, to something of my ability to, sorry about the term here, but my ability to sink myself, to sink my ego, and to subordinate myself, and I've always done that. Whenever I taught, also students as being the exalted position, or at least that I was not above any student. That was all my way of thinking. So I think that big family, and I think big family history is so important because it's more or less never been written, because most of the people that make it through socially are not part of big families.
Yeah.
But I think that instills in you a communal spirit. I would say the curse of individualism, if I was speaking freely, the curse of individualism, of individual identity, is something problematic. Now, Alasdair wasn't from a big family, but I think in terms of his social sense, his communal sense, and his collaborative sense when it came to work. I mean, this gets complicated if we start talking about types of work, because obviously if you work in the film industry or in theatre, it's necessarily collaborative. If you're writing a novel, you might imagine that it's you writing the novel, because you don't think about your editor, you don't think about your agent, you don't think about your publisher, you don't think about the institution that made it possible for you to write and so on. So it's easy to wish all those things away and become this isolated individual. But I think the genres and forms that Alasdair worked in, including public art and so on, meant that he was a social artist by, not just by nature, but by culture, by practice, right from doing the Under the Helmet in 1965 with Bob Kitts,
Yeah.
to the Book of Prefaces, which is an exemplary. I work in the 17th century a lot, and the 17th century is a fascinating period because it's very hard to find a text that is not multi-authored. Pseudonymous, anonymous, and so on, bogus printed and so on. But a lot of work is the work of many hands. Even the prose is work of many hands. I think that collaborative side, we lose it because as we march through the centuries, we become more individual oriented.
Yeah.
We become more bourgeois, if you want to. We become more, we can't see. And this was taken to its height a few years ago when Norton, the big American publisher, published the Communist Manifesto and decided that it was only by Marx. Because who can deal with two authors? I mean, it's just too confusing. But, Beaumont and Fletcher, Marx and Engels, Lenin and McCartney, collaboration has got a fantastic history. But I think it's easy for people to forget that. And obviously, if you're a novelist, it's one thing, or even a poet, I suppose it's even more so.
But even then, as you're suggesting, you can delude yourself that you are producing something on your own. But in order to make the thing, to sell the thing, to share the thing, to move the thing through edits, all of the support and care that needs to go towards people who make things that are imagined, all those things are collaborative as well. It's just maybe easier to delude yourself that somehow you are the solo genius.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the Book of Prefaces.
Yeah, let's definitely do that. So we're going to come to this first collaboration between yourself and Alasdair. I just want to mention briefly that the whole purpose of this series of biographies of people in and around Gray's life is to sort of, rather than focus purely on him, rather to see the world in a sense the way that he saw the world, which was that we are all working together, and some of those ways are visible and others are hidden, but we can make decisions about what we decide to bring back out into the light. And of course, this is a book that says Alasdair Gray on the front, isn't it? But it has many, many authors as well.
So many authors. I love the picture of me, the portrait of me in it, and many other people. So Alasdair always had his helpers.
Can you tell us how you became involved in the Book of Prefaces? Because this is in the box today.
I got a letter from Alasdair out of the blue. I think it must have been 95, 96, basically saying, this is a begging letter.
Yes, that was the first line.
That was his first line. Lovely line. Saying, this is a begging letter. I'm begging you to help out with this book, because it was a book that had gone on for years. Alasdair couldn't finish on it on his own. He needed help. And there's a good lesson for collaborative writing in this, because Alasdair asked me to select from a long list a couple of authors that I could write about, and it just happened that I'd given a lecture on William Wycherley's The Country Wife, one of the most obscene plays in English literature. Not quite, but anyway, it was a play that I'd just lectured on.
Yeah.
So I saw the name Wycherley and I thought, Wycherley, Etheridge, Restoration playwrights, I'll write on them, I've just been let, that's easy, because all the other good people were taken. So I said, I'll do those two, and I decided to do it. But this is a good bit of editing and writing collaboratively. You ask somebody their opinion, and then you reject it, and you improve your original idea. So Alasdair said to me, go away and write William Wycherley and George Etheridge, which I did, And I had a whole theory of restoration drama at the time, which was you could draw a straight line through Ben Jonson, John Milton, the divorce pamphlets, right up to restoration comedy writers, supposedly. And it was a radical line. You know, it wasn't that suddenly in 1660 Charles II was restored 11 years after his father had his head cut off, and you got this reactionary literature that was about, as David Bedell puts it in a documentary, fun and wigs. The Restoration Comedy was fun and wigs. I didn't believe that, and I said so in my pieces. Alasdair didn't like that, because Alasdair believed that Restoration Comedy was reactionary and was a reaction against the revolutionary literature of the likes of John Milton, Marvell, and others. So Alasdair basically took my, you know, as I saw, my little precious thoughts on Restoration Comedy, and threw them away and rewrote them in his image. But in order, so what I'm saying is, he took what I had given him and rejected it, and in rejecting it was able to write what he wanted to write. So I enabled him to do that. I had the cheek to put that in my CV, those two pieces. So I thought, when I did write them, the fact that you won't find much of a trace of them, and I think I might have published the Wycherley piece. It was my
different context.
My Wycherley essay was my Wycherley lecture and essay. You know, I brought in the great Gatsby, Michel Foucault. Oh, it was fantastic. But as I say, it wasn't what Alasdair wanted, because Alasdair wanted not fun and wigs, but the fact that it was a trivialisation of politics. It was into marriage and women and making a good this and that and other things. Whereas I saw a political through line. So Alasdair did a good thing, and that's another thing in collaboration. It's never 50-50. It could be 60-40, 70-30, 80-20, 90-10, it might even be 100-0, as in this case. But what Alasdair got from coming up against my different line was the chance to just pursue his much, I mean, because the great thing about the book of prefaces is that a lot of people have written the different pieces, but really it's Alasdair's book, so Alasdair's name should be on it. And I think Alasdair had to hear, it was almost like having a conversation or running a seminar. Alasdair had to hear contrary views, or views opposed to his, in order to construct the book. I don't know how many other people were tampered with. But and the other story of the book of prefaces is Alasdair said, I can't pay you, but I'll do a portrait.
Stop there. I want to know about this. I'm going to reveal that very slightly. Just to explain, I should have said up front a little about what the Book of Prefaces is and what Alasdair's situation was when he approached you. Because I agree with the way that you described it, but it makes it sound like it was all part of a healthy, straightforward process in which, you know, the work was being stress tested, where it was often being done in financial or time panic, and was a reaction of a kind as well. The Book of Prefaces was first announced in Canongate's catalogue for their next year's books in 1986, and it was finally published in 2000. So it was a spectacular 14 years late. And over that period, Alasdair would work on it intensely for a while, and then he would run out of money and need to promise to go away and do something else, during which time Poor Things and Something Like That and all sorts of other stuff was written. And often he was responding to the fact that he needed money, but was always trying to cobble together this book that he wanted to do a series of commentaries on introductions to great works of literature in the English language from a series of different nations. Now, by the time we got into the mid-90s and he got in contact with you saying, I am begging you, he had run out of money again, and was overpromised, doing a whole series of other projects, and it was getting further away from being done rather than getting any closer. So am I right in thinking the idea was that somehow by farming out some of these prefaces to others, that somehow Alasdair would save time and energy? Was that your understanding initially?
He would pay in portraits. So he would pay people.
Which makes no sense, because it takes way long. How long was it supposed to be, your initial entry? 300 words?
I think it might be more. It might be something like it might be 600.
So let's say 600. Let's round up to 1,000. How long do you think it takes to paint a portrait as compared to writing 1,000 words?
For Alasdair, I think it took a few hours. It was a few hours with Alasdair.
Okay. So it wasn't actually saving him any time at all.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah.
That's why I wrote to him and said, Alasdair, I'll do this, I do not want a portrait. Don't do a portrait, because if you don't have the time to do this book, you don't have the time to do a portrait. And Alasdair insisted on I had his summoned me to 4th of December 1998 to his house, and he insisted on doing a portrait. And I learned a lot about Alasdair. He was sitting there wheezing, I'm asthmatic, so I have my pencil. If I need my pencil, I'll just take it, Why stick your head in a bucket of water when you can't take it out to get 3 times already? So Alasdair was sitting wheezing, and I said, Alasdair, have you got an inhaler? Take an inhaler. Oh no, he'd taken his maximum dose of inhalations. I was thinking, I couldn't live like that. I could not comply with medical. Don't do this at home. But I couldn't. So that was it. Alasdair sat and wheezed. But he also sat and spoke constantly, educated me massively, and as I say, did this remarkable portrait, which is, it's basically I did a portrait done for handing in something that Alasdair completely rewrote.
And I accept that you presenting your view of these writers was a kind of stress test for his own ideas.
Yeah,
but is it? Why don't I say what I think it is, and then you can tell me whether you agree or not, rather than me telling you what you think. But it seemed to me that seeing these things play out again and again, there was you also did the same with A.L. Kennedy, and the same with Janice Galloway, who approached to write entries here, and multiple other writers as well. It was a mixture of genuine generosity of spirit and wanting to be collaborative, but also, when it came down to it, an inability to leave the words alone, and a compulsion to impose himself on language and ultimately make all those decisions himself, even if that meant taking longer, it not making any time or energy sense, and it costing him money.
Exactly, it wasn't one for shortcuts. And Alasdair wrote letters to you, and where he'd made a mistake in the handwritten letter, he would Tipp-Ex it out and paste over it the correct word. So he was painstaking, laborious, and it was always long. He went round the long way, and I think he did that for this book. When he got those helpers in, I think that was just a way of having other voices that he could then accept or overlook as he so chose.
Do you think that's what it always was, rather than simply, I need people to help me out? Because I don't think I considered that, actually.
No.
I think I'd always assumed that he had just needed help, but when it came to it, he was incapable of leaving the contributions from others alone, rather than seeing it the other way around.
I agree with that. You put your stamp on it. I think it was about, as you say, finance. Being chased by a publisher was a terrible experience. Publishers and editors pursuing you is a horrible thing. So I think he didn't want to finish the book, and he thought by drawing in these people who had all this range of expertise. The mixture of writers, poets, novelists, and academics that he got involved in this is also testament to Alasdair's reach, and also Alasdair's appeal to people who are willing to say, I'll drop everything in the middle of this busy period of mine in order to help you to do this thing that you're doing. And it's an amazing piece of work. I wrote to him, Alasdair wasn't very up on literary theory. I think for
He was quite dismissive, wasn't he?
It was, but for historical reasons, because of the way literary theory had been introduced and had arrived, it became associated with Alasdair, and Alasdair might I think slightly snobbish attitude to literature. So I wrote to Alasdair thinking I was clever, and I said to him, this thing you're doing in prefaces is really interesting, because Jacques Derrida's got this book, Dissemination, and he talks about the preface. Prefaces are written after a work, they go at the front of the work, so it's this whole time out of joy. And Alasdair wrote back a lovely letter and said, I'm really not interested in any of these isms. Marx is all these isms. I had the heart to say to him, it's deconstruction, not deconstructionism. But Alasdair, so he dismissed my attempt to say, actually what you're doing is very much like what Derrida was doing, which is to fasten on to peripheral or fragmentary pieces of text and show that they're actually essential to understand the work as a whole. So looking at a preface to a work, or an afterword, even there's some marginal part of it, can give you, and that was Derrida's entire philosophy, as it were, so in the margins of philosophy. This was Alasdair's version of the margins of literature. To look in the margins of literature, to look at how these prefaces could tell you something, could almost be I don't know, mugger, but a guide, a quick guide to the history of English literature. Actually reminded me of another story there, teaching English literature through a series of fragmentary text. So I think Alasdair, yeah, he was doing something, but he didn't buy it.
Okay, but you not agreeing on everything didn't stop you being friendly, and then soon after you were collaborating again. So this brings us to the next intersection, if you like, that's explored in this mini biography, which is, excuse me, the invitation for Alasdair to become involved in what was then your University of Glasgow and also University of Strathclyde master's course as it existed in 2000, 2001. Can you give us a window into how that came to be?
Yeah, when Philip and I founded the course in 1995, we saw ourselves as caretakers or curators. And Philip said, one day writers will come in, will take over, and they'll run this, and we can go back to our corners and work on Ed and Spenser or James Joyce or whatever. And that, with various attempts to talk about creative writing centre and so on, creative writing fellowships, but eventually we decided we were going to have a professor of creative writing at the University of Glasgow. That was the big idea, as it were. And that ended up being a three-way professorship with Alasdair Gray, Tom Leonard, and James Kelman.
What a great idea. I bet that had no complications about it.
Oh, it's so simple and
worked out very well for everybody.
Yeah, easily managed. It wasn't like herding cats.
No.
It was so easily managed and so on. Actually, the first time I heard, they'd only been there 3 days, but I heard a colleague say, he was asked about the three Brits. He said, oh, it's wonderful, but utterly unmanageable.
Right,
But
yeah.
that was a good thing. Who wants to be manageable?
Nobody.
But they were brilliant, they were a magnet for writers, they brought lots of attention to the course, and they were fantastic. I mean, you know, because you had Alasdair Gray as your tutor, I'm afraid.
Yeah, this was the beginning of my writer's education. So I've been an undergraduate at Strathclyde, and just around the time that I was in honours year, creative writing wasn't really a thing very much yet, but we had Robert Allen Jameson, great Shetlandic writer at Strathclyde at the time, and I'd taken him a couple of early short stories, and he said, these aren't absolutely terrible, you should keep going. And I went, really? And he said about the course that you were running, and just at the same time, Alasdair and Jim and Tom took on that post, and suddenly there was this buzz everywhere about the fact this thing was happening. And on getting to the course, I remember you had these old school little slips of paper, and that first week, where you could put your first, second, and third choices for your tutor. And I'm afraid I've told this story before, but I said 1, Alasdair Gray, please. Number 2, Alasdair Gray, please. Number 3, please, I'm really here to work with Alasdair Gray, please don't give me anybody else. And some people absolutely hated working with him because he was unmanageable. Right? But, I know that in some of the donations that you've made, there are mentions of some of his other tutees, who I remember finding it was absolutely infuriating to work with, because in that sort of manner of dedication, there were these obsessive and compulsive ways of supporting others that sometimes would accidentally appear to flatten others. Yeah. But I was just so pleased to be in the room that I was prepared to forget all of that, and then suddenly have this amazing opportunity to see him at work, being his secretary at the same time as being his tutee. But he would have said himself he didn't help my first novel at all. He just wrote over it, and then Tipp-Ex'd over it, and then Tipp-Ex'd over it again. It lasted, how long did it last?
I think it lasted a long time when you think about it, because Alasdair retired, because Alasdair, I think, was 67 when he came to do it, and I think he was 67, 2001. So Alasdair retired. Jim was disaffected and left, but Tom Leonard stayed on and was hugely generous with his time. He took a poetry class on Saturday mornings and so on. So Tom really took to it. Tom loved working with poets, and some very good poets that he worked with. He worked with several poets. Buchanan was one of them. Jen Hadfield, who won the T.S. Eliot Prize. That was one of Tom's students. Dorothy Alexander, brilliant author, poet. So Tom loved it. Jim didn't and struggled a bit with it. One of the difficulties, being summed up very quickly in 3 points, was they were all full-time writers. They weren't academics, they were wonderful critics. Every single one of them had written non-fiction, prose, criticism, and knew a critical history. They were better. It might be better Marxists or deconstructionists or whatever than some of my colleagues. But so they were smart critics, but they were full-on writers, and they were working in a new area. And there's been the research has been done to show that if you teach creative writing, it is much more demanding than teaching Shakespeare. That's just a fact. If you think about it, you tell a student they've got a B or a C or a D for the Shakespeare essay. Do they care? You tell them that the short story they wrote about their mother's death, you see, there's a different, it's a visceral, emotional, intense relationship that people have with creative writing. They don't, so that's a fact. And then there's a third fact, which is universities, especially in the UK, I know it was different for a while in the States, it'll be changing now, but universities don't have the apparatus, and I mean that, the administrative apparatus and support for the kind of academics that are doing labour-intensive work, which creative writing teaching is. So there were circumstances surrounding the creative writing course which meant there wasn't a great deal of support for the writers. There were full-time writers with other projects on the go, the time again, and it was demanding in itself. I mean, I remember when we came in and put the timetable out, and Jim Kelman and others come in and started planning what we were doing, thinking, there's an easier way of doing that. It's a bit like if you came in and said, I'm going to teach 5 seminars this week. They're on Samuel Beckett, but I'm going to make it a different Samuel Beckett text every one. Or I'm going to make the first one Samuel Beckett, the second one James Joyce, the third one Yeats and whatever. So I think their generosity with their time was astonishing. And they didn't really, so I think timetabling was an issue, the first issue, because they just poured them, if they're going to do something, they're going to pour themselves into it, they're going to be all in with the feet. And I think that was very tiring for them.
But it was still I mean, all of that is true, and there's no point blinking from it. But it was also a period of incredible excitement around the course, a lot of joy for lots of people that were involved in it at the time. It was very exciting to have so many of the best Scottish writers alive and at work in and around the course, and there were many others giving one-off sessions as well.
James Kelman was in the office next to me. I come in every morning. You don't always come in with a spinning instead and go to your work, no matter how much you enjoy it. But I used to come in the morning, up the stairs, walk into that little corridor next to classics, and there was James Kelman, Willy Maley, Paddy Lyons. I thought, what's not to like about this job? It was wonderful. So I would say it was a gift, and then it was an amazing moment. It was short-lived. In the case of Alasdair, who retired, Jim, who was unhappy with aspects of the experience of teaching at Glasgow. But for Tom Leonard, he went on as long as he could and gave brilliant, fantastic lectures as well. So yeah, it was a really good experience.
I'm just going to ask a couple more questions and then open things out. So you've suggested already in some of the stories that you're telling that multiple figures here are putting on and taking off different hats and taking different roles in kind of communitarian making or supporting of other writers. And so I just want to look at a couple of examples of where your role shifted there. One of the donations to the archive is The Ends of Their Tethers, which when it was published, somewhere between the proofs and the final book, it changed from The Ends of Their Tethers to, in fact, I remember the day it happened because I was working for Alasdair as a secretary and I had to type out the letter telling the publisher at the last minute he was changing the title. It changed to The Ends of Our Tethers, which he felt was more inclusive, more about us, it was more about community. You reviewed that novel. Sorry, it wasn't a novel, it was a collection of stories. Sorry, that's it. You reviewed the collection, didn't you?
I reviewed it for the Herald, and Alasdair very politely didn't mention the review. It was a good review, it's worth reading. He did mention another review I'd written of a book, it was a biography of Tolkien. Very acerbic review, and Alasdair bumped into me in Bath Road, or I bumped into him, and he said how much he'd enjoyed that review. But the Ends of Our Tethers was a fantastic book, and one of the donations is my bescribbled proof version. That, in other words, my review copy of the End of the Tale is one of the things in the boxes, but I thought that was a delightful collection. And one of the great other things about Alasdair wasn't politically correct, as you know. He predated political correctness. So things kind of hung out in a way that they wouldn't have hung out. The same was true of Philip Hobsbaum, you know, they would say things that would not be welcomed, I think, now, say in a seminar or whatever. And I thought within that collection too, there was a kind of frankness and fearlessness about Alasdair's writing. He didn't write as though someone was looking over his shoulder, and I think that makes his writing very distinctive.
Yeah, he had a lot of fun writing it. That was the first experience that I had of working as secretary and seeing how he composed a sentence, composed a paragraph, composed a story, how pieces were edited, how sentences were flipped around, and then there was silence for 5 minutes, and then it was flipped back again. It was a real education to be able to see how those were put together. But my main memory of it is him laughing while he was doing it, and writing as entertaining himself, rather than as trying to impress or to look clever or to try and somehow suit some perception of the work that already existed.
Yeah. I mean, when writers laugh at their own work, comedians, that doesn't necessarily mean it's good. But in Alasdair's case, I think Alasdair's a very good judge, and he knew when he did something that was special. That was a very special collection.
We're going to open up this collection soon. I don't know if you're cutting a ribbon, but I think you're at least pulling a thread.
It's a bit like This Is Your Life, you know?
Yeah, it's exactly the same as This Is Your Life. Is there anything that you would like to point to in all of it? Because you've made all of these donations to the Alasdair Gray Archive, which supports the archive. It proves, it's like proof of concept for what is happening with the rest of this series of biographies as well, which is that if we are expansive and generous and giving and inclusive, that we can gain a greater understanding not just of an individual writer as the sole genius, but rather get more of a sense of the community. Is there anything that's in these donations that you want to pull out and mention, or something that you value?
Is the latest idea that Alasdair wrote to Strathclyde about examining?
Yeah, I think so.
Because if that's in there, that's really interesting. Because I heard of this letter, I heard from Zoe Wickham actually, and from others, that Alasdair had written a letter to the University of Strathclyde so incendiary. People were in rehab, they were in therapy, there was at least 2 deaths that were being investigated and so on. And I heard this and thought, Alasdair, letter, what they would call it, a letter, I thought, this seems very, very strange, So I didn't really believe it, but I thought, well, maybe he was angry, maybe he was upset, I don't know. Eventually I saw this letter, it was such a lovely, I immediately said, Strathclyde senior admin have to get out more. There's just not enough happening up there. And the letter was lovely, because the letter was basically an explanation for why, if he took on this job at the fee that was being offered, he'd be getting paid a penny an hour or thereabouts, because he explained the effort he would put in to marking these creative dissertations. He just explained the time. Now, anybody who's ever been a GTA, graduate teaching assistant in Glasgow, knows that if you were paid by the hour, you'd be living in 1824. So Alasdair just wrote a letter saying, this is what you've asked me to do X, you've offered to pay me Y, it would take me Z to do it. That was a letter. And this letter was apparently something that received some kind of rebuke or, I don't know, something. That was how I and anyway, the letter came into my hands. It's not my letter. I have deleted the letter because I think it speaks to Alasdair. It also speaks to the fact that Alasdair was aware that time-consuming, labour-intensive work should be recompensed adequately. And of course, it never is. If you're a career academic, that's different. Yeah. But if you're somebody who's come in to mark papers, I once marked 50, 10,000 word creative writing dissertations. You do the math. That was a lot of work. But I had a job at the time, and that was my job. But I think if somebody was not an external examiner, no about this. But anyways, that was Alasdair's riposte, was to say, this is not adequate remuneration for what's expected of me, given how much I would put into it.
But that's exactly the kind of thing that when he had the ability to, he could defend for others. So I had direct experience of that myself, that he would always pay me a tradesman's wage, as he said it, even if it was much more than he was being paid per hour, which is part of the reason he was always in a financial mess, not purely because he was paying me, but it was definitely a factor. So he was, and his final novel, Old Men in Love, the alternative title for it, right up until it was going to be published, was Who Paid for All This? So he's like, whether it's that or it's the, this is also in the Grey Archive, Alasdair's piece in 1986 about the way visual art was valued or not valued in Glasgow. All of his pieces about cultural erasure in Glasgow over the decades. Many of these things are rooted in the fact that he believed that artists were not able to be paid for the work that they did, even though there was inherent value that others wished to extract something from. So it was incredibly rare that anybody would point out that it would take time-wise. Also, Alasdair was saying that he would take a lot longer than most people. So he said, again, this was a compulsion. He wasn't capable of just skim reading something and giving 3 or 4 lines of commentary and feeling okay and going on to the next bit. What he says, I think, in the letter that you donated was that, I'm interested in how it came into your hands, by the way, that sounds magical, but that he would have to read it over 3 or 4 times. He's not able to do something that's feedback in just a few lines because he would have more that he would want to say. He'd have to revise what he wanted to say. All of this is a way of conserving the art by giving it its due time, care, and attention, which I think is also a communitarian-minded way of seeing what art is for. But when that comes up against the admin team, I can understand why that might have been seen in that particular way. Of course, things have radically changed in Strathclyde since. We do everything perfectly now, but maybe not in those days. I interrupted you. What you had to say?
I think you did.
Did I not?
No.
Well, I'm going to do my best all this time. Okay. I'm glad I happened just now. I'd love to open out to questions. These questions can be anything to do with Willy's own writing, career, life, interactions with Alasdair. We'd love to have any questions related specifically to the donations to the Grey Archive, or anything at all to do with Glasgow history, culture, writing, pictures. This is the bit where everyone goes quiet, and then this usually lasts for a couple of minutes before somebody looks at someone else and says, I'll stick my hand up. Someone's just got a mic if anybody has any questions.
Questions, comments,
Refutations,
you know,
disputes, complaints.
Keep talking. See, Alasdair was strong meat for some people. I had a friend who was a park and we were in a chip one night upstairs in a perfectly quiet and reasonable evening, and Alasdair appeared talking to me, and this friend said after 30 seconds, William, you leave, I have to leave, because he found Alasdair overwhelming. That's all, he just found Alasdair too much. And that reminds me of another great story. Philip Hobsbaum was loud. Colin McCabe, as one of the people was loud. And Colin said to me one time, we'd been in this before, I think maybe the early stages of Alasdair's relationship with Chip. But Colin McCabe went into the Chip with Alasdair and were asked to leave, I think by other customers, because basically they were talking so loud that it became a breach of the peace. And if you knew, if you heard the two of them talk, you can imagine what that was like. So yeah, Alasdair was quite overwhelming. You knew when you were with Alasdair. He wasn't quiet, if you know what I mean.
No, and it wasn't always, it often wasn't conversation exactly, which is why that ability to be generous whilst also talking over something or talking at something, that's something that's really quite rare.
Yeah, it was the good show. It's a bit like Michael Benteen, Spike Monaghan, because Alasdair did like a performance, they did all these voices, so he'd say my friend, so and that was a bit, he weren't used to it, but he didn't know the work and so on, you just think, why am I here?
Yeah, you might have to run away.
If you tuned in, you realise there's just so much wisdom in there.
It was, the longer that passes since I first met him, the harder it is to put myself back in the headspace from before I already had a sense that I was in a room with somebody who was worth listening to. Because it's hard to let some of that go. But I do definitely remember feeling like it kind of didn't matter who you were, and in a way you were invisible. I have said in the past that we have to be incredibly careful about diagnosing people after their deaths. And we don't know, we are way more than our diagnoses anyway, all of us. But Alasdair has certainly developed ways of engaging with the world socially, to be able to manage, on one hand, a very high level of intellect, and also a deep discomfort with social interaction, and finding certain parts of that incredibly difficult. And it played out sometimes as this kind of extraordinary monologue that would move through different voices and different registers and in and out of particular different texts. But it would
That's true, it wasn't solitary. I would say Alison needed people who needed to sit, you might just say it's a sounding board. I'm only here to write virtually an average abstract and 100. But that's fine. I think we all go through life and we say things, we're told it's nonsense, and we move on, but we say things we're told it's nonsense and think, I'll give you nonsense. And we come back, and I think that's how people, it's like being edited and so on. Alice definitely liked the company of others, and he liked, even if it meant he was just speaking at them, because he got something from that, he got kind of echo, he got to hear his own, he tried things out.
Well, I always felt like because he felt this compulsive need to do all the talking in a room, that the ways of being generous came out in other forms. So whether it be giving people money, supporting others, pointing to the work of other writers, trying to include, trying to collaborate. I always think of the 5 artists retrospective that he did with the other artists from Glasgow School of Art in 1986. And Alice never sold more than one painting at any of these exhibitions. And nobody had, very few people felt that visual art had any financial value until Saoirse came along, and then Alasdair was already in his 70s. But the very fact that that entire exhibition, which was funded by himself, existed supporting 3 other lesser-known visual artists than himself, and he was almost completely unknown, and also one artist that had died many, many years beforehand. Those were the ways in which that generosity came out, and you could see that he was continually making decisions about how to include others or to foreground others, or to push people forward, which is why many of those people kept reappearing in the work again and again over time.
And I was always an example.
Well, I was trying to formulate a question. I was going to ask, can you give us an example of other writers, either that are included in the Alasdair Others project here, and Agnes is one of them, or anybody else in and around Alasdair's community where you felt you could see that in action?
It's quite hard, isn't it? Because Yeats mentored and supported other writers. Did James Joyce? Not to my knowledge, there might be something out there. So I think some writers influence whole generations. They influence them through their work. Yeah. Other writers really they want to help other people to fly and to progress and so on. And say Philip was like that. When I mentioned names of people that didn't do that, because Philip mentioned some Scottish writers that he felt hadn't been mentors or advancers, but they weren't enabling others, essentially. And I think Alasdair definitely did. He brought other people into the fold. And obviously support for him and so on is one example of that. But I think Alasdair supported me. He led by example in his work, in Warnock, for example, and then Poor Things. Poor Things is my favourite work of Alasdair.
No, it's unique, but okay.
There's great one things like pat my tongue again and say a side effect of treatment I'm getting. But Alasdair was somebody who wrote about working class life and working class childhood in particular in upbringing. And ways that are remarkable, and even things like that's the way a night off that he wrote about Kick-Hands. And so I think these were visionary stories that Alasdair was writing, but only now with the benefit of my retirement can I look back and see that Alasdair understood things that were happening in Glasgow before other people started to be the recording angel that Alasdair was. I think he had a very strong grit of, you know, planners' dreams gone wrong and what was happening in Glasgow. I'm not going to make a biofluid psychology today, for example, but Alasdair was very sharp on those kind of changes and kind of ahead of his time as well.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to wrap up by saying that the purpose of this series of works is to try and work against that erasure that Alasdair was often working against. Did you say recording angel? You used recording angel there. Yeah. Alasdair would often, in writing or in person, talk about the decisions that he was making again and again, individually, collectively, over a period of decades as well, you know, to try and work against the erasure of Glasgow as a city, individual people, places, things that he valued that he either felt were being cut out of the picture, would never make it into the picture at all, which is why there were in the auditorium, for example, was a picture of Garden of Eden on one hand and ordinary Glaswegians on the other, and the mirrors of the cleaners next to the great writers. All of these are decisions that are working against erasure. And I suppose the last thing I want to leave you with today is the idea that the whole spirit of this project, of which Willy's biography is just the first event, and hopefully there'll be plenty more. The idea is to take those principles of working against the erasure of people and places and things and culture in this city's history, and to open it up, and to be inclusive with it and generous with it, and to see what we can find, and to rifle through other people's papers. I'm lucky that Willy's given a few of those to me as well. So I've got a few things that in the future I can say came into my hands in that way. I think, should we open the box and then invite people to have a look around? Do you want me to come back in?
Yeah, just to say thanks to Rog and Willy for that fascinating conversation. I think you can see there was a few slides that we put up, which was some of the highlights from what Willy and Rog were talking about. But the box is laid out over here for you to explore. The majority of it is in micron sheeting. A lot of it is two-sided, particularly some of the letters that Willy was discussing. So feel free to have a look through and explore. We've also got some of the guides over here from some of the other biographies that we've been writing of others connected to Alasdair. That's part of our own growing collection. The majority of these have been written by students who come on placement with us, so we've been supporting them to explore and write biography, often editorial support, so that you can get a sense of the wide-ranging different groups of people that we're looking at. So some of them of which Rog and Willy had discussed, including some of his contemporaries from art school, and then there's some contemporary artists that Alasdair was working with more recently, including Nicole Beatley and Siobhan Healy, both contemporary artists who've supported some of his later commissions and public artworks too. This is a growing part of what we want to do at the archive, to really use it as an opportunity to mirror what Alasdair was doing. So there's a duty of care. I think we feel a responsibility that some of these histories could potentially be erased if we don't proactively try and fix them. If you do want to come and visit the archive, our next feature is on Friday. We've got a few more features before the end of the year. Also, if you have any Alasdair Gray material, or you know anyone who does, please come and speak to me. I'd love to chat and find out more about that. But can we just join me in thanking Rog and Willy again. Thank you.
Fantastic. So, just a basic sentence.
It's obviously an empty box, Willy.
Pretend there's something in it.
See you in my family. That's your selection box. Something you can't live on.
Thank you very much, everybody. Please feel free to have a look around.